Hey everybody, in this video I'll be giving you an overview of the rectangular pattern command in Fusion 360. To demonstrate this command, I went ahead and modeled up a square plate with a countersunk hole and a slot that's cut all the way through. So let's go ahead and begin by clicking on rectangular pattern. As you can see, we get a window that pops up for the rectangular pattern command, and we get three main areas that we can interact with at this point in time. Let's start with type. We get a drop-down menu, and if we expand this, we have faces, bodies, features, and components. It defaults to faces, so let's discuss that first. As the name suggests, faces allows us to select a specific face on our part to use for the rectangular pattern. So let's select the face for the actual hole here, and we'll select a direction, pull this arrow over, and as you can see there, we only have the hole portion. We don't actually have the angled cut for this countersunk hole. If we click OK, you can see this. All right, so we just have the holes there. Let's go back into rectangular pattern. Now let's go ahead and capture the entire countersunk hole with the faces type. We'll go ahead and select this top part here and the hole here. Select a direction, and as you can see, we've now captured that entire feature by selecting the two individual faces. Our next type option is bodies, and what that allows us to do is it allows us to select entire solid bodies rather than just faces like we've previously seen. If we expand our bodies folder, you can see that we have body 1 and body 2 as separate solid bodies. So if we were to select body 2, for example, and then pick a direction in which we want to replicate this, click OK, it only replicates solid body 2. If we were to select the other solid body, you see here it selected solid body 1. We pick a direction and pull this over, it will replicate that solid body. Next, we have features for our type selection. And this allows us to pick up features in their entirety. So this is very useful for things like countersunk holes, because when we took a look at faces, we had to select two separate faces to replicate this entire feature. If we use the features option, we can just hover over any part of that feature, click once, and then we can go ahead and select our direction and other parameters. We'll get to those in a moment. And when we click OK, as you can see there, it's picked up that entire feature with a single click. Our final type option is components. So similar to bodies, components allows us to select an individual component in its entirety. We could select it from the model browser, so we could hover over component 1 here, and it would select that cylindrical feature, or we can just click that feature in our design space, or that component in our design space rather. So when we click on that, it'll select that. Now we can select our direction in which we want to pattern this and click OK. Moving down in the rectangular pattern command window, we have our object selection filter. This allows us to pick up various objects like faces, bodies, features, and components like we've previously seen. It's pre-selected, and I know that because the box is filled with color blue. And if it's not, so let's say if we were working with the directions filter, but now we want to either select additional objects or deselect objects and reselect some, we can click on that select box there. It populates with the color blue. Now we're all set to pick up whatever we want to replicate. If we want to deselect objects, we can either click this X button here, or we can hold Shift and then left click on whatever we want to deselect. Moving down, we have our directions selection filter, and this allows us to pick the direction that the pattern goes in. So first, let's select our object of interest, which will be this countersunk hole. We'll activate our directions selection filter by clicking on the select button. And now we could select either an edge or an axis to designate our desired direction for the rectangular pattern. So if we select this edge here, it's going to move in this direction. If we were to select this edge, it would move in that direction. So it would be parallel to that line created by that edge. After we've selected our objects of interest along with our direction that we want the rectangular pattern to go in, we get access to various parameters that we can use to provide finer control over the execution of the rectangular pattern command. So let's begin with distance type. The first distance type is extent. Extent defines the total distance for all instances of this rectangular pattern feature in a direction. So let me explain. If I drag this out to 2 inches, all 3 instances move along this direction because I've selected this edge as my direction for a total distance of 2 inches. If I use the second option, which is spacing, and set that distance as 2 inches, now the gap between each instance is now 2 inches rather than the total distance being 2 inches. Moving down, we have the suppress option, which is deselected by default, but to enable it, all we have to do is click inside of this box, and now we have the ability to selectively include or exclude instances of this replicated feature. So let's say, for example, we did not want this instance and we did not want this instance, but we want all others. We can do that. If we want to put those instances back in, all we have to do is click on these boxes here and here, and we get those back. Next, we have our quantity parameter. Currently it's set to 5. We can use these up and down arrows to change the quantity, or we can type in a number. So we could type in the number 5, for example, we can type in the number 2, and so on and so forth. So that's how we set the quantity of instances for this patterned feature. The distance parameter, as we've already seen, sets the distance for the rectangular pattern. Moving down, we have direction type, and by default, direction type is set to one direction. So what this means is that the instances for my rectangular pattern are going to move left to right in a single direction. So if I set my quantity to 3, it's 3 total instances going in one direction. But if I set this to the other option for direction type, which is symmetric, it's going to evenly space all 3 of these instances about the original feature that's being patterned. Now, as we move down in our rectangular pattern command window, you'll notice that we have several repeat parameters in the form of quantity, distance, and direction type. These are here because we can actually pattern our feature in 2 separate directions at the same time. So let's do one instance of this countersunk hole on each of the 4 corners on this plate. To do this, we'll set the first quantity to 2. We'll set our appropriate distance to achieve this, which is 3.65 inches. Okay, so that takes care of the first direction. Now let's take care of the second. So we'll do the same for this one. We'll set this to 2 for the quantity, and then we'll set this to 3.65 inches for that distance. So now we have one instance of this countersunk hole on each of the 4 corners in one step. This can be extremely useful because if we make any changes to this first feature, all of the other instances will automatically update to reflect those changes. So let me show you what I mean. So if we click OK, and then we go back to that original hole that we're using to create the pattern off of, and we just change some of the dimensions. So let's say we just change it like that and click OK. All of these 4 instances, including the original, are updated.